Today's talk is not about giving you simple relationship advice. This is not a checklist of do this or don't do that. This is a deeper inquiry into what happens when a human being begins to lose trust in their own perception inside a relationship that calls itself love. This talk is for those who have quietly started asking themselves a dangerous question. Am I the problem? Am I too sensitive? Am I overreacting? Because the moment you begin to doubt your own reality, something fundamental has already shifted. Let us begin with a philosophical clarification. What many people casually call jealousy is often not jealousy at all. It is a psychological structure, a structure in which anxiety disguises itself as love and control speaks in the language of care. In these relationships, the question is never simply, do they trust you? The real question is, who defines reality? Many people in these situations ask themselves, shouldn't I be more understanding? Isn't it my responsibility to endure for the sake of the relationship? If they are struggling, shouldn't I try harder? But from a philosophical standpoint, a relationship is not sustained by the endurance of one person's sacrifice. A relationship is only sustainable when the self remains intact within it. The moment maintaining the relationship requires the erosion of your own perception, your own judgment, your own emotional truth. It is no longer a relationship. It is a system. There is a profound teaching found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It warns that after death, the mind encounters terrifying visions. But these visions are not external threats. They are projections, manifestations of one's own attachments and fears. And the text gives a crucial instruction. Do not mistake what arises from fear as reality. Now consider this carefully. In a relationship dominated by obsessive suspicion, the accusations you face may not originate from your behavior. They may be projections, forms shaped by the other person's unresolved anxiety. But here is the most dangerous turning point. It is not when those projections appear. It is when you begin to accept them as real. That moment sounds like this. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I gave the wrong impression. I'll be more careful next time. These are not statements of empathy. They are transfers of authority. You are no longer interpreting reality. You are asking permission to exist within it. Let me be precise. The most frightening aspect of such a relationship is not the anger, not the surveillance, not even the accusations. It is the moment the victim begins to distrust their own perception, because from that point on, the relationship may appear calmer, but it is no longer healthier. It is simply quieter. Philosophically speaking, love is a relationship between two autonomous selves, each recognizing the other as an independent subject. Control, however, is something entirely different. Control is a structure in which one person becomes responsible for, regulating the emotional instability of the other. In these relationships, you are no longer a partner. You are a stabilizer. But if we return to the insight of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a critical principle. Each being must pass through their own bardo, their own intermediate state. Their fear, their attachment, their anxiety cannot be processed by someone else. It cannot be outsourced, and it certainly cannot be solved by sacrificing yourself. Now, we must address something even more subtle. There are moments in these relationships that feel normal again. Moments when the tension disappears, when the accusations stop, when peace seems to return. And many people think, maybe things are getting better. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe we're finally healing. But this is often the most dangerous phase, because what appears as recovery may actually be reconfiguration. In this phase, the system has not collapsed. It has adapted. The visible behaviors change. The questioning becomes less direct. The surveillance becomes less obvious. The tone becomes softer, even apologetic. You may hear, I realize I was wrong. I didn't understand how much you were hurting. And this is where many people fall back in, because it sounds like accountability. But listen carefully. True accountability sounds like this. This is my internal issue. I need help. I am responsible for changing this pattern. What you often hear instead is, we were both sensitive. We both made mistakes. This is not resolution. This is redistribution of responsibility. And at that moment, something critical happens. The victim begins to say, yes, maybe we both contributed to this. And just like that, they are pulled back into a shared responsibility structure for a problem that was never equally shared. Another shift often occurs in this phase. Affection increases. More warmth, more intimacy, more future planning, and it feels convincing. But this is not necessarily the restoration of trust. It is often an attempt at re-anchoring connection. Because in these dynamics, affection is not always an expression of love. Sometimes it is a mechanism of containment, a way of saying, you are still within my emotional territory. So now we arrive at the essential question. Not, do I have the right to leave? But rather, do I still have a reason to stay? This is the correct philosophical framework. Because leaving is not about qualification. It is about recognition. Here is the first criterion. If explanation does not resolve the issue, but instead raises the standard of proof, then the system is not repairable. You explain once, they ask twice. You prove twice, they require 3 verifications. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a structure that sustains itself through repetition. Again, the ancient text reminds us. Attachment does not repeat because it is satisfied. It repeats because repetition itself sustains it. Second, if maintaining the relationship requires you to reduce yourself, to calculate before speaking, to prepare explanations in advance, to prioritize no conflict over genuine peace, then what you are experiencing is not harmony. It is psychological exhaustion. Leaving in that moment is not selfishness. It is self-preservation. Third, and most decisive, if their emotions begin to feel like your responsibility, their anxiety feels like your failure, their anger feels like your mistake, their collapse feels like your obligation, then what you are experiencing is not love. It is role entrapment. And this brings us to the question of guilt. Where does guilt actually come from? Not from leaving someone, but from believing, I am responsible for their emotional stability. That belief is the distortion. In the language of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, each being must walk through their own field of consciousness alone. You cannot carry another person's fear through it. You cannot resolve their attachment on their behalf. So understand this clearly. The calm phase is not always healing. It may be a strategic reset. And leaving is not an act of punishment. It is the recognition of a truth that the relationship itself cannot contain. When you leave, something profound happens. For the first time, the other person is forced to confront their own internal reality without you mediating it. Whether they grow from that or repeat the same pattern is no longer your responsibility. And perhaps this is the most important conclusion of all. Recovery is not about finding someone new. Recovery is about returning to a state where you no longer need to explain yourself to feel safe. That is the moment your perception returns. That is the moment your self is restored. And only from that state can a real relationship begin. At the end of our last discussion, we arrived at a crucial realization. Recovery is not about finding someone new. It is about returning to a state where you no longer need to explain yourself in order to feel safe. And yet this is where many people become confused. Because once you finally step out of a controlling, anxiety-driven relationship, something unexpected begins to surface. Not relief, not clarity, but something far more unsettling: emptiness. So let us examine this carefully. What is this emptiness that so many people experience after leaving a psychologically controlling relationship? Why does it feel, paradoxically, as though something is missing, even when the conflict is gone, even when the pressure has disappeared? Many people describe it like this: I feel more at peace, but strangely hollow. There's no fighting anymore, but it feels like something is missing. At first glance, this seems like a contradiction, but it is not, because this emptiness is not the absence of love. In fact, it is the opposite. It is the absence of stimulation that your nervous system had become conditioned to depend on. Let's break this down with precision. In a relationship driven by obsessive suspicion and control, 3 powerful stimuli are constantly repeated. First, chronic tension, the anxiety of not knowing when suspicion will arise. Second, compulsive justification, the ongoing pressure to explain, prove, and defend your reality. Third, intermittent relief, the temporary calm that follows conflict. This creates a neurological loop: anxiety, explanation, temporary relief. Anxiety again. Over time, your brain becomes conditioned to this cycle, not because it is healthy, but because it is consistent. So when the relationship ends, something profound happens. The anxiety disappears. The need to explain disappears. The conflict disappears. And yet your brain does not interpret this as peace. It interprets it as, why is nothing happening? Why does this feel so quiet? Why does this feel empty? This is the critical misunderstanding. The emptiness you feel is not a sign that something is missing. It is a sign that something toxic is no longer present. It is the space left behind after the removal of psychological overstimulation. And here is why this moment is dangerous. Because if you misinterpret that emptiness, you will try to fill it. And more often than not, you will fill it with something familiar. This is when people begin to ask themselves, do I still have feelings for them? Was I actually more alive back then? Maybe it wasn't that bad. But these questions are not coming from clarity. They are coming from withdrawal. You are not missing the person. You are missing the intensity. You are not longing for love. You are craving the cycle. And this is why people often return. Not necessarily to the same person, but to the same type of relationship. Because the nervous system does not seek what is healthy. It seeks what is familiar, even if what is familiar is harmful. So the question becomes, how do you prevent yourself from being pulled back into that cycle? The answer is counterintuitive. You do not fill the emptiness. You learn to tolerate it and reinterpret it. First, do not label emptiness as a problem. It is not a malfunction. It is a recalibration. Your perception is returning to baseline. Second, do not mistake silence for danger. A lack of conflict is not abandonment. A lack of tension is not disconnection. It is safety. Third, retrain your emotional response. Instead of reacting to intensity, begin responding to stability. Pay attention to relationships where you are not anxious when there is no message. You do not feel compelled to explain yourself. You can exist without performing. At first, these experiences will feel boring, but that boredom is not emptiness. It is peace without adrenaline. Now, let us move to a deeper and more critical question. Why do some people collapse psychologically inside these relationships? Where is the exact breaking point? It is not when the accusations become louder. It is not when the anger becomes explosive. The most dangerous moment is far quieter. It is when the victim begins to say, maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I gave the wrong impression. I'll be more careful next time. These statements sound like reconciliation, but they are not. They are transfers of authority. When you say, maybe I'm too sensitive, You are no longer trusting your perception. You are granting legitimacy to distortion. When you say, maybe I caused misunderstanding, you are no longer evaluating events objectively. You are internalizing blame for someone else's projection. And when you say, I'll be more careful, you are no longer negotiating boundaries. You are agreeing to self-restriction. From that moment on, something irreversible begins. The other person no longer needs to prove their suspicion because you have begun to regulate yourself on their behalf. This is not conflict resolution. This is self-erasure. A true reconciliation process adjusts mutual standards. But these statements do not adjust standards. They abandon them. You give up your right to interpret reality, your trust in your own perception, your autonomy over your behavior. And that is why the relationship may become quieter, but it will never become healthier. From a philosophical lens, this dynamic resembles what is described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The greatest danger is not the illusion itself, but mistaking the illusion for reality. In these relationships, one person projects fear outward, but the deeper harm occurs when that projection is implanted into another person's mind. This is not merely misunderstanding. It is the colonization of perception. So now we must ask a final structural question. Why is it so difficult to leave these relationships even when you understand them? Why do people stay? Because this is not simply emotional attachment. It is addiction. These relationships operate as a reinforcement loop. Tension, self-correction, temporary peace, emotional reward. And here is the critical insight. Addiction is not formed by pleasure. It is formed by the relief from pain. You are not addicted to suffering. You are addicted to the moment suffering stops. This is why leaving feels harder than staying. Because when you leave, you are not just losing a person. You are losing the only system your brain has learned to associate with relief. And this creates withdrawal symptoms. Am I being too cold? What if I misunderstood? There were good moments too. This is not love speaking. This is the nervous system attempting to return to a familiar loop. Again, the ancient teaching reminds us. What you cling to in fear does not liberate you. It binds you. So let us summarize with clarity. This kind of relationship is not sustained by love. It is sustained by repetition. The victim does not become attached to pain, but to relief. And the more conditional that relief becomes, the stronger the attachment grows. Leaving, therefore, is not weakness. It is not abandonment. It is not failure. It is the moment you recognize that the truth of the relationship is greater than what the relationship itself can sustain. And finally, there is one more question we must confront. A question that determines whether you will truly be free or whether you will return. Why is it that no matter how much reassurance is given, some people can never feel secure? Why do explanations, promises, even marriage and children fail to create lasting stability? If you do not understand this, you will go back. You will think, this time will be different. Now they understand. Surely this is enough. But the issue is not information. It is structure. And that is what we will explore next. In the next lecture, why those driven by chronic insecurity can never feel fully reassured. Why reassurance itself strengthens the cycle. And why your perfection can never solve their fear. Because the deeper your understanding becomes, the less guilt you will feel, and the clearer your judgment will be. If this talk helped you regain clarity, consider subscribing and share so that more people can begin the process of reclaiming their own perception. In the next session, we will examine the final structure, why control can never produce true security.